I'm a dermatologist and a mom of a 2-year-old, so let's talk about sunscreen and sun protection for kiddos. I'm Dr. Sam Ellis, and I'm a board-certified dermatologist in Northern California. I'm here to help you understand your skin and find products that work for you. So if that sounds good, give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. First, I'm gonna talk a little bit about general sun protection tips for kids, and then I'm gonna get into my favorite sunscreen, so make sure to stick around for that. And the reason I really wanted to go over this is because as a dermatologist, I get asked all the time, one, can I even put sunscreen on my kid? There's so many recommendations out there about not using it, especially if they're under 6 months old, but also like which sunscreens can I actually use for my child and have them be safe? Now, it's not that sunscreen is inherently unsafe for someone under 6 months of age, or that something magically happens when a kid turns 6 months old where their skin is suddenly receptive to sunscreen. The reality is we don't want infants under the age of 6 months to have any meaningful sun exposure. So really the recommendation is there because we want kids, and infants in particular, to be spending limited amounts of time in the sun. But I really want to emphasize the point that it's not problematic to put sunscreen on someone who's under the age of 6 months. So for example, when my son was really young, we still liked to go hiking and we were outdoors a lot. And of course I had him in a hat and sun protective clothing, but his little hands were exposed. And so I did put sunscreen on his hands and I wasn't worried about it. And I'll talk a little bit more about my favorite sun protective clothing for kids in a little bit. Now, say you've decided, okay, I am going to put sunscreen on my kid. They are getting some sun exposure and I want to protect them. Then the question becomes, well, do I need to use a mineral sunscreen or are chemical sunscreens also okay? You'll hear that information put out there all the time from dermatologists, pediatricians. It just comes from every angle that kids can't use chemical sunscreen, and I kind of want to debunk that. And for clarity's sake, when I'm talking about mineral sunscreens, I'm talking about sunscreens that use zinc or titanium dioxide as the UV filters. And when I'm talking about chemical sunscreens, it's basically any other UV filter out there. The reasons mineral sunscreens are recommended so much is there's a little bit of a misunderstanding in how mineral sunscreen filters work. Many people have been taught that zinc and titanium dioxide work to protect you from the sun by reflecting the sun's rays. But in reality, they work very similar to chemical UV filters in that they absorb the sun's rays and then break down that UV radiation so that it never causes harm in the skin. People have also expressed concerns about systemic absorption of chemical UV filters into the bloodstream, which of course, when you're thinking about your kids, that's not something you might want. But even though chemical filters have been detected in the bloodstream in small amounts, they've never shown any harm to human health. And my thought on this is, well, if I as an adult feel comfortable using a chemical filter on myself, which I completely do, then I also feel comfortable using it on my kids. I'm not going to do special treatment for my kids and not treat myself the same way. And I also find it really interesting because when I've talked to my dermatology colleagues who live in the UK, for example, they've told me like that discussion of mineral versus chemical sunscreens really doesn't happen here. Like it's all about sun protection in general and we're not looking into the nitty-gritty of the sunscreen because we know it's not problematic. But for whatever reason, this myth of mineral sunscreen is the only appropriate sunscreen for kids has been perpetuated in the United States. The last thing I'll say about chemical versus mineral is that kids' skin can be a little bit more sensitive, and for some people, chemical UV filters can cause more irritation. So if you're noticing that chemical filters are causing problems for your kids, of course that's a reason not to use them. But I've also seen zinc and titanium dioxide based sunscreens cause rashes and irritation in kids as well. One thing I want to be very clear about is any FDA approved sunscreen in the United States is not toxic for kids or for infants. It's absolutely appropriate to use sunscreen in exposed sites when your kid or infant is exposed to sunlight. One other thing I really want to go over when it comes to applying sunscreen on kids, and really this applies to adults in my mind as well, is that I'm really not the biggest fan of using powders or stick sunscreens. The reality is when you're using a powder or a stick sunscreen, the amount of sunscreen being distributed on the skin is a lot more unknown, and most people are going to be getting inadequate protection when they're using that type of sunscreen application. And if you're an adult and you're using a sunscreen stick or powder, sometimes you have a better sense of like, hey, my skin is feeling a little bit hot or I'm overheating, I need to go reapply. But kids are not as tuned into those sensations, and they're going to trust that whatever protection you gave them is going to be enough, and so use enough. And then kind of in this vein, I also do not recommend transferring your sunscreen into any other packaging to apply to your kids. So for example, people will send me DMs all the time about this particular device called Solar Buddies. It's like a little brush where you kind of transfer the sunscreen into an applicator and then it brushes on your kids. But the problem with that is that if your sunscreen is living in this alternative packaging, it also can become destabilized and less effective. And believe me, as a mom, I completely understand the want to make sunscreen application as fun and as interactive and as approachable as possible, but I still don't recommend this. And a couple of other mistakes I see when adults are applying sunscreen onto kids is, one, they're applying it way too sparingly. It should not be something where we're doing like a little dab and a little dab. Like, get those hands coated in sunscreen and just go at your child. You're definitely gonna meet a little bit of resistance, and certainly my son, this is not his favorite part of the day, but the more you can get them used to putting sunscreen on, the more receptive they will be to it in the future. If you're under applying sunscreen, you're kind of giving yourself a false sense of security, and the last thing you want is having your kid come in with a sunburn. I've had many parents bring their kids in with sunburns, and they feel just as guilty as the kid feels badly for having the sunburn. Now, the amount of sunscreen you're going to use is really going to vary based on the size of your kid, but my thought is that it should feel a little bit hard to rub all of the sunscreen in. To me, that is the best measure, is like you're kind of on the verge of, did I put too much on my child? And that's the right amount. The other thing that's really important, and a mistake I see all the time with kids and adults, is not reapplying the sunscreen frequently enough. So if your kid is at the beach or at the pool, at a minimum, they need sunscreen reapplied every 2 hours. But if they're getting out of the pool and they are drying their skin off with a towel, that towel is also rubbing off that sunscreen and they need reapplication afterward. Typically, I recommend to my patients who have younger kids to tie sunscreen application to another activity that their kid does frequently. So for example, when I'm at the park or I'm having a day out with my son, every time my son has snack time, it's also sunscreen reapplication time. You also might have heard sunscreen needs to be applied 15 minutes before sun exposure, and that's not because it needs 15 minutes to activate, but really the sunscreen needs to form a nice even layer on the skin, which it can take a little bit of time to settle, and you don't want to be getting that sunscreen wet right after you apply it. So you definitely don't want to be jumping in the ocean or jumping in the pool right after your sunscreen goes on. So I recommend, if you're going to something like a water park or the beach, rather than saying, okay, we're gonna put our sunscreen on when we get to the beach or when we get to the park, that should be something that happens in advance of the exposure. So you could stop at the gas station 10 minutes out for a potty break or maybe a snack break, and that's where you're applying your sunscreen, so that when you get to your destination and your kids are excited to be there, they don't have to pause that fun to apply their sunscreen. Now, I'm about to get into my top sunscreen recommendations for kids, but I also think it's so important that we are not just relying on sunscreen for sun protection. Australia, for example, is really well known for their sun protective campaign called Slip, Slop, Slap, Seek, Slide. And this is really a way to not just focus on sunscreen, but also other sun protective measures. And if you're not familiar, SLIP stands for slip-on UV protective clothing. I'll definitely link some of my favorite UV protective pieces for kids in the description box, but it's becoming a lot more ubiquitous. For example, H&M now has UV protective clothing, and then I'm a huge fan of a brand called SwimZip because they have great options for sun protection for kids, and there's lots of different styles, and it's relatively affordable. SLOP stands for slop on sunscreen, so we'll talk about that in a second. SLAP stands for slap on a wide brim hat. And if you've seen my Instagram account, you know my son Theo is always wearing a hat, so I will link some of our favorites in the description box, but I get them on Amazon. And you really do want to make sure this is a wide brim hat. Baseball caps do not protect very much from the sun. And so many times when I show pictures of him wearing a hat, I get messages like, well, how do you get your kid to wear a hat? So one, I model that behavior. So whenever we're outside, I am also wearing a hat. So it's just like a thing we do when we're outside. And two, we just do it all the time. We started him wearing a hat when he was like 6 months old, and now it's just a habit, and he asks for his hat now when we're outside. The more you normalize and model good sun protective behaviors, the more your kid will be used to those things as they get older. And my goal with my son is not that he is ever scared of the sun or doesn't want to be outside, but he has an understanding that when we are outside, we use protection. And then to round out that campaign, SEEK stands for seeking shade. So ideally, we are not spending massive amounts of time in the sun from the hours of 10 a.m. till about 4 p.m. And the final part of this is SLIDE, which is slide on UV protective glasses. Now, I have not been able to get my son to tolerate sunglasses, but with that wide brim hat, I'm not really worried about it. Now let's get into some of my favorite sunscreens for infants and kids. This is not only what I recommend in my own clinic day to day, but also what I use on my son. And I'm going to give you both mineral and chemical sunscreen options because, like I said before, both are safe in infants and kids, and they each have their unique benefits. First up is one of my favorite sunscreens for kids, and it is the Pipette Baby Mineral Sunscreen SPF 50. I really like this sunscreen for kids, and honestly for adults as well if they want a mineral-only option. One, I really like that it comes in a nice big tube, so you don't need to be stingy with your sunscreen application, which is an issue that I see come up time and time again. But I also really like that it rubs in quite effortlessly. So it is a mineral sunscreen. A mineral sunscreen without some type of white cast really doesn't exist, but I do find that this rubs in quite well. And if you've ever tried to put sunscreen on a kid who's screaming or running away or just fighting the application, the faster you can get that sunscreen rubbed in, the better. Compared to a lot of mineral sunscreens, this also feels quite lightweight on the skin, and it also has things like squalane in it, which are going to add this moisturizing factor. So you get a little bit of sun care and skin care. I do want to make a note that this is not water resistant, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. For example, if you're not going to the beach or to a water park, it doesn't really matter if it's water resistant. It has the same lasting power. And the benefit of not using water resistant sunscreen every day is that it's a lot easier to rinse off at the end of the day. And I will be giving my favorite tip for how to get sunscreen off kids at the end, so make sure you stick around for that. Another mineral sunscreen that I use a lot on my son is from my brand Prequel. It's our Sun Barrier Mineral Sunscreen SPF 50 PA++++. And the reason I started applying this to him was he was seeing me apply it in the morning and he was asking if he could have some on his skin. And I thought, yeah, of course you can. And like I mentioned before, I find that to be a huge plus when it comes to kids' sunscreen, and especially ones that are mineral-based. This sunscreen also has antioxidants and bisabolol to soothe the skin, so it's really nice for adult skin and for kids' skin. My son, for whatever reason, cannot tolerate all of the mineral sunscreens out there, but he does really well with this one. I also had a follower send me a note saying that her daughter loves this sunscreen because it's very slightly tinted pink. So if you have someone who's resistant to sunscreen, finding those little charming attributes, whether it's a bottle that they really like or a scent or the color of the sunscreen, can be beneficial in getting your kid on board with application. So this sunscreen sort of lives in our diaper bag, and then we pull it out at the park for reapplication for me and reapplication for him. Now, if you are planning on some water activities, I do have a mineral sunscreen recommendation that is water resistant for 80 minutes, and that is the Blue Lizard Baby Mineral Sunscreen SPF 50. Now, you don't have to get a sunscreen that specifically says for babies or for sensitive skin. A lot of that is just marketing, and when you compare those ingredients to their adult mineral versions, they are exactly the same, but regardless, I like this sunscreen a lot. This sunscreen is a top recommendation from a lot of my dermatology colleagues. It's definitely got that classic thick, whitish, slightly paste-like effect of typical zinc and titanium dioxide-based sunscreens, but I almost like that in a way because if my son is going in the water, I kind of want to be able to see just a little bit exactly where I've put the sunscreen, and this allows me to do that. That being said, I've definitely tried thicker and pastier zinc oxide sunscreens that I absolutely cannot get behind, and a lot of the ones I found at the drugstore kind of are like that, so that's why I've opted for Blue Lizard so many times. Now let's move on to chemical sunscreens because I find that these are a lot more practical. One, because they rub in super well, but two, they don't leave any type of white cast on your skin. So if your kid is a little bit sensitive to having that white hue to their skin, or if your child has more pigment in their skin and those white casts tend to show up more prominently, a chemical sunscreen can be a really good option. I often find that I'm reaching for chemical sunscreens just because it's what I'm putting on myself, and I'm more than happy to put that on my son as well. First up is the Banana Boat Light as Air SPF 50 sunscreen. This is one of my all-time favorite sunscreens, not just for kids, but also for adults. One, it is crazy affordable. Two, it rubs in so effortlessly, like you rub it on and it disappears into the skin. Three, it has a really lovely fragrance. It's not overly fragranced, but it just has a nice smell that masks that traditional chemical sunscreen aroma. And I think we're all used to that chemical sunscreen smell, especially if we're at the pool or at the beach. But if your kid is wearing sunscreen on the day-to-day and you don't want them smelling like sunscreen, or they don't want to be smelling like sunscreen, this is an excellent option. And I find that I reach for this one the most because not only can I reapply this on my son at the pool or the beach, but also I want to use it, my husband wants to use it. It's just a very utilitarian sunscreen. Also, from a texture standpoint, it really just feels like putting on body lotion. So it doesn't give that same kind of burden some of us feel when we have to go and apply sunscreen. It's just like, oh, I'm applying body lotion and I also happen to be getting SPF 50 coverage. And lastly, I do want to give a sunscreen spray option. And I think for many of you, you might be going like dermatologist giving a spray sunscreen option, but as I've become a parent, I've realized like you cannot always get your kids on board with a lotion-based sunscreen, and I'd rather have them use something than nothing. The beauty of a spray sunscreen, of course, is ease. You can just spray it on, rub it into place, and go. One of my absolute favorites is by Coppertone, their Sport Sunscreen Spray. I buy this in like multi-packs because it's just so easy, and it's just something that is always in one of my bags in case I need to reapply on the go on me or my son. Now, this is not my favorite way to apply sunscreen if it's the first application of the day or what I would call your base coat, but a lot of kids are not going to sit for a full lotion reapplication at the beach or at the pool or at the park, so if you can just get a little spray on them, I will accept that. Now, the key with using a spray is that you want to hold it about 6 inches from your skin, you want to do a nice even stream back and forth several times, and then you do want to rub that in with your hand. If you just spray, you're gonna miss spots, and you will see that later reflected in a very patchy sunburn. If I'm going to use a sunscreen spray on my son, who's only 2 years old, I actually like to spray it into my hands first and then apply it because he's too young to understand the concept of holding your breath. And of course, with these aerosolized products, we really want them on our skin and not getting into our lungs. So as much as possible, I just sort of apply it to my hands and then to him. But for older kids who understand the concept of holding their breath while they apply their sunscreen, this is okay. Those are some of my top sunscreens for kids, but any sunscreen that an adult can use, a kid can use. So if you have something that you really enjoy, it's totally fine to put it on your child. Now, one quick note before I wrap this video up, I do want to talk about how to get sunscreen off of kids because that can be a little bit of a task. One of my best tips for this is to use a makeup eraser cloth. And makeup eraser is just a brand name of a microfiber cloth. And these are really easy to find online. I will definitely link them in the description box. But the beauty of a microfiber cloth is that you can rub it over the skin with pretty minimal friction, and it helps lift off that outer layer of makeup or sunscreen. Because I think we've all had that experience of trying to use just traditional soap and water to get our makeup off or to get sunscreen off our kid, and it doesn't always work. Sometimes adding in that frictional component of a washcloth can be helpful, but it's nice to use a microfiber cloth because they are a lot more gentle on the skin, but still just as effective. And then when it comes to washing the skin, I also really like the Bioderma Adoderm Cleansing Oil. This is a cleansing oil I recommend to a lot of my patients with eczema, but it's also really good at breaking down sunscreen. So when your kid's in the bath or the shower, they can apply this cleansing oil. It will help break down the sunscreen, and then you can go in with a makeup eraser cloth to remove the rest. What are your favorite sunscreens for kids? Definitely share in the comments. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.